The morning sun rose over the endless fields of New Haven, painting the crops in shades of gold and green. Daewon stood at the edge of his property, a simple mug of coffee in his weathered hands, watching the automated harvesters move through the wheat. To anyone observing from orbit, he looked like every other farmer in the colony. That was exactly the point. His communicator buzzed quietly against his wrist. Daewon glanced at it and saw the code he had been dreading for 3 years. 3 short pulses, then 2 long ones. Company was coming, and they were not friendly. He took another sip of coffee and activated his response with a subtle tap. Across the colony, 49,000 other colonists received the same signal. Not one of them panicked. They had all been waiting for this day. Tae-sung was 23 years old and had been on New Haven since he was 15. He was checking the irrigation systems in Sector 7 when his own communicator buzzed. He stopped his inspection and looked up at the sky. It was still clear and blue, but somewhere up there ships were watching them. Ships that thought New Haven was easy prey. The young man smiled and continued his work. The irrigation pipes he was inspecting were running perfectly. They would need to be. In a few weeks, maybe less, these pipes would be doing something very different than watering crops. In the central administration building, which looked like nothing more than a large barn, Hana was reviewing data on her screens. She had designed most of the colony's infrastructure herself. The Galactic Council's agricultural inspectors had visited twice and found nothing suspicious. They saw greenhouses, silos, processing facilities, and irrigation networks. They never looked deep enough to see what else those structures could do. Her screen showed the orbital paths of 3 Vraxian scout ships. They had been watching New Haven for 6 days now. Hana sent her analysis to Daewon. The scouts were doing standard reconnaissance patterns. They were lazy patterns, the kind used when you did not expect any resistance. Yuna worked in Greenhouse 7, which grew tomatoes and peppers for the colony. She was also the colony's primary communications officer, though that particular detail was not in any official record. Her greenhouse had enough antenna arrays hidden in its structure to contact every human world within 50 light-years. Right now she was listening to the Vraxian scout ships talking to each other. They were speaking in standard Vraxian military code, which human intelligence had cracked 4 years ago. Yuna translated their conversation in real time and sent it to Daewon. The Vraxians were not impressed with New Haven. They called it a soft target and a resource opportunity. They estimated the colony could be taken with minimal force. That evening, Daewon called a meeting of the Harvest Council. To the outside world, it was a gathering of farming cooperative leaders. In reality, it was the colony's military command structure. They met in a processing facility that smelled of grain and machine oil. Kyung-ho arrived first. He maintained the colony's heavy equipment and had grease under his fingernails to prove it. He was also a former Special Forces operative with 3 tours in the Outer Rim conflicts. He nodded to Daewon and took his seat. Sujin came next, still wearing her botanical research coat. She grew the crops that fed the colony, but she had also designed certain genetic modifications that the Vraxians would find very surprising. She carried a tablet showing the growth rates of her latest project. Hana arrived with Yuna, both looking tired but alert. Miran and Jae-hwan came together, laughing about something that had happened at the eastern farms. Hyun-woo was last, apologizing for being late because his children had been difficult to put to bed. They all looked like farmers and parents and normal colonists. That was the greatest trick humanity had ever played on the galaxy. Daewon activated the secure holographic display. The room's windows automatically darkened and signal jammers engaged. The display showed New Haven from orbit, exactly as the Vraxians were seeing it. Peaceful, vulnerable, worthless except for its food production. Then Daewon changed the display. The same image appeared, but now it showed what was really there. The grain silos that were actually missile batteries, the irrigation network that doubled as a sensor grid, the tractors with military-grade armor folded inside their farming shells, the greenhouses that could seal and function as fortified bunkers, the processing facilities with railguns hidden in their roofs. Every single structure in New Haven had 2 purposes. The entire colony was a weapon disguised as a farm. Daewon spoke quietly. The Vraxian Empire had decided New Haven was worth taking. Their scout ships had been joined by a battle fleet. 10,000 ground troops were preparing to deploy. The Vraxians expected to take the colony in less than a day with minimal casualties on their side. Kyung-ho asked the question they were all thinking. Did they have authorization to engage? Daewon nodded. The message had come from Earth itself. New Haven was cleared to defend itself by any means necessary. The pretense could be dropped. Soo-jin asked how long they had. Daewon checked his data. The Vraxian fleet would arrive in orbit in 22 days. They would probably spend a few days positioning themselves and making demands. Then the invasion would begin. Hana began outlining the defense plan. They had practiced this hundreds of times in simulation, but never with actual enemies. The colony would continue operating normally until the very last moment. The Vraxians would see farmers farming, children playing, life continuing without fear. That would make them even more confident. When the Vraxians landed, they would walk into the most comprehensive trap ever designed. Every field, every road, every building was part of the kill zone. The colonists would hit them from every direction at once. Yunwoo raised a concern. There were children in the colony, real children who needed protection. Daewon assured him that the shelters were ready. They were listed in the colony records as root cellars and storage facilities. In reality, they were reinforced bunkers that could survive orbital bombardment. The meeting continued late into the night. They reviewed every system, every contingency, every possible scenario. By the time they finished, each member of the Harvest Council knew exactly what their role would be. As they left the facility, Daewon stood alone for a moment, looking at the holographic display. New Haven had been built for this purpose. It was humanity's answer to a dangerous galaxy. Species like the Vraxians thought humans were weak because they grew food and built peaceful settlements. They thought farmers could not be warriors. The Vraxians were about to learn a very painful lesson. Every human colony was a fortress. Every farmer was a soldier. And New Haven was ready to teach them exactly what happened when you tried to harvest humans. Daewon turned off the display and walked back to his house. Tomorrow he would wake up, drink his coffee, and watch the fields like always. The Vraxians would see nothing but a simple farmer. They would never know what was coming until it was far too late. The Vraxian battle fleet emerged from hyperspace like a storm of metal and fire. Commander Throcknar stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking down at the green planet below. New Haven appeared on his screens as a cluster of farms and small settlements. Nothing that could challenge his 10,000 warriors. Throcknar had conquered 14 worlds for the Vraxian Empire. This would be the easiest. The humans had no warships in orbit, no defense platforms, no military installations visible from space. Just farms and farmers. He ordered his fleet into standard occupation positions. Down on New Haven, Tae-sung was in the fields when the ships appeared. He looked up at the sky and saw the small dots of light that were Vraxian vessels. His heart beat faster, but his hand stayed steady. He continued checking the irrigation system like nothing was wrong. Other colonists did the same. They farmed and worked and lived their lives while an invasion fleet positioned itself above them. Daewon received the detailed scan data from Yuna. The Vraxians had 3 capital ships, 12 escort vessels, and 36 troop transports. It was enough force to conquer a small nation on an undefended world. Against New Haven, it might not be enough. He walked to his communications console, which was hidden in what looked like a livestock feed storage room. Daewon opened a channel to the Vraxian flagship. His message was polite and calm. He identified himself as the colony administrator and asked what the Vraxians wanted. Throcknar's response came within minutes. His terms were simple. New Haven would surrender immediately. The colonists would provide food and resources to the Vraxian Empire. Resistance would result in complete destruction. They had 12 hours to comply. Daewon thanked the commander for his message and said the colony would need time to discuss. He asked for 24 hours. Throcknar, confident and generous in his overwhelming power, agreed. The humans could have 1 day to accept the inevitable. That night, the Harvest Council met again. Daewon informed them that the Vraxians would land at dawn in 2 days. The landing zone would be the eastern fields, which had the most open space. That was exactly where New Haven wanted them to land. Hana pulled up the tactical display. The eastern fields looked like perfect landing ground, flat open with good sight lines. The Vraxians would bring their transports down in a standard deployment pattern. They would unload their troops in organized formations because they expected no resistance. What the Vraxians could not see was what lay beneath those fields. The irrigation system there was the most sophisticated in the colony. Thousands of underground pipes connected to hundreds of concealed weapon emplacements. The crops themselves were a special variety that Su-jin had spent 2 years perfecting. Kyung-ho reviewed the armored response plan. The colony's tractors and heavy equipment were positioned in maintenance facilities around the eastern fields. Each vehicle had been modified over the past 3 years. Their farming shells would separate in seconds, revealing military armor and weapons underneath. Miran showed her drone deployment strategy. The colony had 60 agricultural drones that sprayed crops and monitored plant health. Each drone had been manufactured with a secondary configuration. They could become combat units with weapons that would surprise any military force that dismissed them as farming tools. Jae-hwan explained the artillery positions. The 3 largest grain silos overlooking the eastern fields contained missile systems instead of grain. The silos could open, fire, and close again in under 30 seconds. From orbit, they would still look like storage facilities. Hyunwoo outlined the ground force response. Every colonist over the age of 18 had military training. They knew their positions, their weapons, and their objectives. They would fight like farmers defending their homes because that was exactly what they were. But they would fight with military precision because that was what they had trained for. The next day, Daewon sent another message to Throcknar. The colony would not surrender, but they would not fight either. They requested that the Vraxians leave them in peace. It was a message designed to make Throcknar angry and confident. It worked perfectly. The Vraxian commander broadcast his response on every frequency. He called the humans foolish and weak. He said his warriors would take the colony by force and that the humans would regret their defiance. He moved up the invasion schedule. They would land at dawn. That night, New Haven transformed. The change was invisible from orbit, but every system activated. Weapon emplacements ran final diagnostics. Armor plates unlocked from their hidden positions. Ammunition was loaded into weapons that had been empty minutes before. The colony that had been a farm became a fortress. Tae-sung stood at his position in the eastern fields. He wore his farming clothes and carried a tool bag that contained items very different from farming equipment. Around him, other colonists took their positions. They looked like farmers preparing for a normal day of work. They were actually soldiers preparing for battle. Yuna monitored Vraxian communications from her greenhouse. She listened as Throcknar gave orders to his troops. The commander was telling them this would be easy. He warned them not to damage the farming infrastructure too much because the Empire wanted to use it. His warriors laughed and joked about how quickly they would take the settlement. As the sun rose on the invasion day, 36 Vraxian troop transports descended through the atmosphere. They moved in perfect formation, heading for the eastern fields. Their approach was textbook standard. They expected to land, deploy, march to the settlement, and accept surrender before lunch. The transports touched down exactly where Hana had predicted they would. The landing burned the crops and kicked up massive clouds of dust. Vraxian warriors poured out of the ships in organized waves. They wore combat armor and carried plasma weapons. They formed up into companies and battalions preparing to advance. Throcknar watched from orbit and smiled. His warriors looked magnificent. The humans had not fired a single shot. Perhaps they would surrender after all when they saw this display of military power. The Vraxian forces began their march. 10,000 warriors advanced across the fields toward the human settlement. Their formation was perfect. Their discipline was excellent. They moved like the professional soldiers they were. Daewon watched them come from his command post in the administration building. He waited until the Vraxian forces were exactly where he wanted them. The entire enemy army was spread across the eastern fields, surrounded by crops, walking past irrigation systems and over underground sensor networks. They were in the heart of the kill zone. He gave the order that changed everything. 3 words on the command channel that every colonist had been waiting to hear. Harvest protocol active. Across the eastern fields, the crops that the Vraxians were walking through suddenly released a thick yellow cloud. Su-jin's genetic modifications activated all at once. The plants produced a spore that targeted Vraxian nervous systems specifically. It would not kill them, but it would paralyze them for hours. The first 1,000 Vraxians went down in seconds, confusion and panic spreading through their ranks. Then the irrigation pipes emerged from underground. But they were not spraying water. They were automated gun emplacements, and they began firing with deadly precision. The grain silos opened like flowers of metal. Missiles streaked out and up, targeting the troop transports that were still on the ground. 3 transports exploded before their pilots even understood they were under attack. Across the colony, tractors and harvesters burst apart as their farming shells detached. Military vehicles rolled out, their weapons already firing. Kyung-ho led the charge from the south, his armored column smashing into the Vraxian flank. Miran's drones rose into the sky by the dozens. They swarmed the remaining transports, firing precision weapons at engines and control systems. More Vraxian ships fell from the sky. The greenhouses opened up, revealing fortified firing positions. Hyunwoo and his ground forces engaged the Vraxians from multiple directions at once. In orbit, Commander Throcknar stared at his displays in absolute shock. His perfect invasion had become a nightmare in less than 5 minutes. The farmers were soldiers. The farms were weapons. Everything he had seen was a lie. He screamed orders for orbital bombardment, but Yuna had been waiting for exactly that. Jamming signals erupted from every weather station in the colony. The Vraxian communications network collapsed into static and confusion. The battle that was supposed to be a simple occupation had become a slaughter. And it had only just begun. The eastern fields had become a war zone in minutes. Vraxian warriors stumbled through the yellow spore clouds, their nervous systems shutting down. Those who had avoided the initial paralysis found themselves under fire from every direction. The irrigation guns tracked targets with mechanical precision, while human soldiers fired from positions that had not existed moments before. Kyung-ho drove his command vehicle through a burning section of crops, his armored column following close behind. The vehicles that had been harvesting wheat yesterday were now firing explosive rounds into Vraxian formations. His gunner took down a Vraxian squad leader, and the enemy unit fell into chaos without coordination. Through his communicator, Kyung-ho heard reports from across the battlefield. The southern flank was secure. The western approach had 3 Vraxian companies trapped in a crossfire. The northern sector reported enemy forces retreating toward their damaged transports. Everything was going according to plan. Above the battlefield, Miran controlled her drone swarm from a concealed command station that looked like a crop monitoring facility. Her screen showed dozens of camera feeds as her drones hunted Vraxian aircraft. The agricultural sprayers had become deadly predators. They moved in coordinated patterns, overwhelming Vraxian targeting systems through sheer numbers. 2 more troop transports exploded on the ground as her drones found their fuel lines. Miran redirected a squad of drones to support Hyunwoo's infantry. The ground forces were pushing into the Vraxian center, and they needed air cover. Hyunwoo moved through the battle like he had never stopped being a soldier. His team advanced from Greenhouse 7, which had transformed into a fortified strongpoint. The transparent walls were actually armored polymer that could stop plasma fire. The irrigation systems around the greenhouse provided cover and concealment as his soldiers maneuvered. He tagged targets for his team using his tactical visor. The visor looked like normal farming safety glasses but displayed a complete battlefield network. Every colonist was connected. Every weapon was tracked. Every enemy position was marked. New Haven fought as a single coordinated organism. A Vraxian counterattack formed near the crashed transports. Their officers had managed to organize about 500 warriors into a defensive position. They were laying down heavy fire and trying to establish a perimeter. Hyunwoo called for artillery support. Jae-hwan received the request in his command silo. His facility looked like a grain storage tower from outside. Inside it was a state-of-the-art fire control center. His team had been tracking Vraxian movements since the moment they landed. The defensive position that the Vraxians thought was secure had been in his targeting computer for 3 minutes already. He confirmed the target coordinates with Hyunwoo and gave the fire order. The silo walls split open along hidden seams. Missile racks rose on hydraulic lifts already aimed and ready. The missiles launched in a rippling sequence, streaking across the morning sky on trails of fire. The Vraxian defensive position disappeared in a series of massive explosions. The warriors who survived the initial barrage found themselves exposed and under immediate assault from Hyunwoo's advancing infantry. They broke and ran. In orbit, Commander Throcknar struggled to regain control of the situation. His communications with the ground forces were completely disrupted. The jamming was so effective that he could not even get status reports. His sensors showed massive explosions and weapons fire, but he had no idea how many of his troops were still combat effective. He ordered his ships to begin orbital bombardment, despite the communication blackout. If he could not coordinate with his ground forces, he would simply destroy everything. The capital ships began charging their main weapons. Yuna detected the energy buildup immediately. Her sensor arrays, hidden throughout the colony, tracked every ship in orbit. She sent an alert to Day One with a simple message. They were out of time. The Vraxians were preparing to fire from space. Day One had been waiting for this moment. The colony's ultimate defensive system had been kept hidden until absolutely necessary. Now there was no choice. He activated the Deep Protocol. Across New Haven, what appeared to be crop processing facilities began to change. Their roofs split apart like opening hands. Massive railgun barrels rose from underground silos that went down hundreds of meters. These were not simple defensive weapons. They were ship killers, powerful enough to punch through military-grade shields and armor. The railguns required enormous amounts of power. That power came from the colony's geothermal plant, which had been built with exactly this purpose in mind. The entire electrical grid of New Haven had been designed to support these weapons. Every solar panel, every wind turbine, every power system fed into the charging cycle. Hana monitored the power levels from her command station. The railguns needed 90 seconds to reach full charge. They had already been charging for 60 seconds. She watched the numbers climb while Yuna tracked the Vraxian ships. It was going to be very close. Tae-sung had moved to a forward observation position during the battle. His job was to mark targets and guide artillery strikes. Now he watched the massive railgun barrels rise from the ground in the distance. He had known they were there, hidden beneath his feet for years, but seeing them emerge was still incredible. The Vraxian capital ships began their bombardment. Plasma beams lanced down from orbit, burning through the atmosphere. The first strike hit an empty field and vaporized several acres of crops. The second strike was more accurate, destroying one of the smaller equipment facilities. The third strike was targeting the administration building where Day One commanded the defense. The railguns fired 1 second before the plasma beam hit. The sound was not an explosion. It was something deeper, a crack that seemed to split the air itself. 3 railgun rounds, each moving at a significant fraction of light speed, punched through the atmosphere and into space in less than a second. The first round hit Throcknar's flagship on the port side, directly through the main reactor shielding. The ship did not explode immediately. Instead, it went dark as every system failed at once. Emergency power kicked in moments later, but the damage was catastrophic. The flagship was dead in space. The second round missed its target by 50 meters. At orbital ranges, that was considered extremely accurate. It passed through the fleet formation and disappeared into deep space. The third round hit an escort vessel amidships. The kinetic energy was so enormous that the ship folded in the middle like paper. It broke into 3 large pieces and dozens of smaller fragments that began falling toward the planet. The plasma beam that had been targeting the administration building struck the edge of the complex instead of the center. The building's shields, hidden in its structure, absorbed most of the impact. Windows shattered and part of the roof collapsed, but Day One and his team survived. In orbit, the Vraxian fleet scattered. Ships that had been in tight formation broke away from each other in panic. The humans had weapons that could reach them in space. The safe position above the planet was not safe at all. Throcknar, working on emergency power and survival suits, stared at the damage reports in horror. His flagship would not fight again without major repairs. 1 escort was completely destroyed. 3 others had sustained damage from debris. His ground forces were not responding to any communications, and the humans were still firing. Another railgun volley launched. These rounds were aimed at the troop transports still in low orbit. 2 more Vraxian ships died in flashes of metal and energy. On the ground, the Vraxian forces realized they were alone. No orbital support was coming. No reinforcements would arrive. They were surrounded by an enemy that had turned their entire world into a weapon. Some units tried to surrender. Others tried to fight their way to their damaged transports. Most simply collapsed in exhaustion and shock. Kyung-ho's forces captured 3 Vraxian officers in the eastern fields. The prisoners were paralyzed by Sujin's spores and could barely move. They stared at Kyung-ho with a mixture of fear and confusion. He had them moved to a secure medical facility. The humans would treat their wounded enemies. That was the difference between New Haven and the Vraxian Empire. By mid-afternoon, the battle was effectively over. More than 7,000 Vraxian warriors were captured. Perhaps 2,000 had died in the fighting. The rest were scattered across the countryside, hiding or trying to reach extraction points that no longer existed. Daywan stood in the damaged administration building and looked at the tactical displays. They had won. New Haven had defeated an invasion force 10 times what any normal colony could have handled. And they had done it by turning every single aspect of their peaceful farming life into a weapon. But he knew this was just the beginning. The Vraxian Empire would not accept this defeat easily. More ships would come. The real war was about to start. 3 days after the first battle, the sensors detected new ships emerging from hyperspace. This time there were many more. Yuna counted the contacts and felt her stomach tighten. 38 Vraxian warships had just arrived in orbit. They carried at least 30,000 additional troops. She sent the data to Daiwan immediately. He was in the medical facility, checking on the colonists who had been wounded in the first battle. 17 humans had died defending New Haven. Another 43 were injured. Every single one of them was a farmer, a parent, a friend. Daiwan knew most of them by name. The new fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Krelthos, a Vraxian officer known for his ruthless tactics. He broadcast a message to New Haven within an hour of arriving. There would be no surrender terms this time. No negotiations. The colony had destroyed Vraxian military assets and killed Vraxian warriors. There would only be complete destruction. Krelthos was not making the same mistakes as Throkanar. His ship stayed in high orbit beyond the range of the railguns. He began a systematic bombardment of anything that looked like it might be a military installation. Processing facilities exploded. Silos were reduced to craters. Equipment yards burned. But Hana had anticipated this strategy. The real military assets were hidden much better than the obvious targets. The Vraxians were destroying decoys and secondary positions. Every minute they spent bombing empty buildings was another minute for New Haven to prepare. The colony's children and non-combat personnel were evacuated to the deep shelters. These bunkers went down 300 meters and could survive almost anything short of a direct nuclear strike. Sujin helped organize the evacuation, making sure families stayed together and everyone had supplies. Taesung watched the orbital bombardment from a concealed observation post. Plasma beams and kinetic strikes turned sections of the colony into burning ruins. It looked terrible. But most of what was being destroyed could be rebuilt. The Vraxians thought they were crippling New Haven. They were actually just making the colonists angry. Kyung-ho was preparing his armored units for the next ground assault. The Vraxians would have to land eventually. They wanted to take the colony, not just destroy it from orbit. When they came down, his forces would be waiting. But this time the enemy would be ready for human tactics. This battle would be much harder. The Harvest Council met in an underground command center that had been built beneath the administration building. The facility above them was damaged but still standing. This bunker could run the entire colony's defense for months if necessary. Daywan outlined the situation. They had hurt the Vraxians badly, but now the Empire had sent a real military force. New Haven could win another battle, maybe 2, but eventually the sheer numbers would overwhelm them. They needed reinforcements. Yuna had been trying to contact human military command for 2 days. The Vraxian jamming was much more sophisticated this time. She had managed to get one short message through, a simple distress signal with their coordinates. Whether anyone received it was unknown. Hana showed the power status for the railguns. They had fired 8 times during the first battle, and twice more to keep the new fleet at a distance. The power systems could handle maybe 10 more shots before they needed a full recharge cycle that would take hours. They had to make every shot count. Miran reported that she had 42 combat drones left. The rest had been destroyed during the first battle or in the orbital bombardment. She could build more, but it would take weeks. For now, she had to work with what remained. Jaehwan's artillery was in better shape. The missile silos were deep enough to survive most orbital strikes. He had lost one position, but still had enough firepower to support ground operations. His bigger concern was ammunition. They had supplies for perhaps 3 more major engagements. Hyunwoo spoke about the infantry. Every colonist was ready to fight, but morale was fragile. They had won one battle, but now they saw how many more enemies were coming. Some people were scared. Some were angry. All of them needed to believe they could win. Day One stood and addressed the council. New Haven was humanity's statement to the galaxy. Every human colony was built the same way. Farms that were fortresses. Farmers who were soldiers. The Vraxians thought they could bully humanity because humans seemed peaceful. New Haven had to prove them wrong. He activated the Harvest Protocol's second phase, the one they had hoped never to use. It was called Final Stand, and it meant committing everything to the defense. No reserves, no fallback positions. They would win or they would die, but they would make the Vraxians pay for every meter of ground. The next Vraxian assault began 2 days later. Kreltis had learned from the first battle. His troops landed in the western hills far from the prepared killing zones in the eastern fields. They came down at night using stealth systems to mask their approach. 30,000 warriors established a fortified position before dawn. Taesung spotted them using the underground sensor network. The root system that Hana had mentioned was actually a vast array of seismic sensors, motion detectors, and listening devices buried throughout the colony's territory. You could not move a military force across New Haven without the humans knowing. Day One made a difficult decision. Rather than attacking the Vraxian position immediately, he would let them advance, draw them into the colony proper where New Haven's advantages were strongest. It meant allowing the enemy to destroy more of the settlement, but it gave the defenders the best chance to win. Kyung-ho did not like the plan, but understood it. He positioned his armored units in concealed positions throughout the colony's central areas. When the Vraxians advanced, they would face urban combat in a city designed to kill invaders. The Vraxian army began its march at dawn. They moved carefully, expecting ambushes. Their advance was slow and methodical. They had learned to respect the humans. That was good. It meant they were scared. Hyunwoo's infantry made contact with the Vraxian scouts at the colony's western edge. Brief violent firefights erupted and then the humans withdrew. They were not trying to stop the advance, just slow it down and gather intelligence. The Vraxians were using heavy weapons and armored support. They were taking no chances. As the Vraxian forces entered the colony proper, Su Jin activated another surprise. The plants throughout the settlement were modified species. On her command, certain trees released a thick smoke that blocked thermal imaging. Vines growing on buildings began rapid growth, creating barriers and obstacles. Gardens that looked decorative became defensive positions. The Vraxian advance slowed as their sensors were blinded and their paths blocked. They began taking fire from windows, rooftops, and positions that appeared and disappeared. The humans were fighting like ghosts in a landscape that fought alongside them. Miran launched her remaining drones in waves. They could not attack the main Vraxian force directly, but they could harass supply lines and target officers. Her drones picked off commanders, communication specialists, and heavy weapons crews. The Vraxian coordination began to break down. Krelthas, watching from orbit, saw his advantage slipping away. His forces were being bled in 1,000 small engagements. He made the decision that Day One had been dreading. The Vice Admiral ordered his ships to begin a close bombardment, despite the danger from the railguns. He would destroy the colony completely rather than lose another army. Hana detected the ships moving into lower orbit. She calculated firing solutions for all the railguns. They could probably destroy 4 or 5 ships before the rest scattered. But that would leave the guns vulnerable during the recharge cycle. The Vraxians could hit them while they were defenseless. Day One authorized the shots. If they were going to lose, they would hurt the Vraxians as much as possible first. The railguns charged and fired in a perfectly coordinated volley. 3 Vraxian warships died in the first seconds. A 4th lost its main drive and began a slow fall toward the atmosphere. The 5th shot missed but forced 2 other ships to break formation to avoid it. Then something happened that no one expected. New contacts appeared on sensors. Human contacts. Ships dropping from hyperspace in perfect attack formation. The cavalry had arrived. Admiral Park's fleet had received Yuna's distress signal and had been burning at maximum speed for 4 days. 12 human warships, including 2 heavy cruisers, materialized behind the Vraxian fleet. The Admiral wasted no time on warnings. His ships opened fire immediately. The Vraxian fleet was caught between the railguns below and warships behind. Krelthas tried to reorganize his forces, but the humans gave him no time. Park's fleet tore into the Vraxian vessels with weapons designed for exactly this kind of fight. On the ground, the Vraxian army realized their orbital support was gone. They were surrounded, outnumbered by the defenders who knew every centimeter of the terrain, and now human reinforcements were landing. Some units tried to fight on. Most began looking for ways to surrender. But Taesung was about to face his own crisis. He had volunteered for a desperate mission during the chaos of the battle. A small team would infiltrate the Vraxian command ship that was falling toward the planet. If they could capture Vice Admiral Krelthas, they might be able to end the battle without more bloodshed. The mission had gone wrong. Taesung was now trapped on a damaged Vraxian warship, surrounded by enemies with the ship falling apart around him, and no one was coming to save him. The Vraxian command ship shuddered violently as another internal explosion rocked its dying frame. Taesung pressed himself against a bulkhead, his breathing heavy inside the captured Vraxian environment suit. The mission had been simple on paper: board the falling ship, reach the bridge, and extract Vice Admiral Krelthas before the vessel burned up in the atmosphere. Nothing was simple anymore. His team of 5 had been reduced to just him. 2 were dead from Vraxian security forces. 2 more had been forced to evacuate when their section lost pressure. Taesung had continued alone because someone had to complete the mission. Now he was beginning to think the decision had been stupid. On New Haven, Daewon listened to the broken communications from Taesung's suit. The young man was deep inside the command ship, cut off from escape routes, and the ship was falling faster. In 20 minutes it would hit the upper atmosphere and begin to burn. Daewon had to make a choice: send a rescue mission or accept that Taesung was lost. Hana was already planning the rescue before Daewon asked. She had been monitoring the command ship's trajectory and had an idea. It was dangerous and probably impossible, but it might work. They needed a ship capable of matching course with the falling Vraxian vessel. They needed it to be small enough to dock with the damaged airlocks. And they needed a pilot crazy enough to try. That pilot was Hana herself. She had flown combat missions during the border wars before becoming an engineer. She had not forgotten how. More importantly, New Haven had one craft that could do the job. The heavy harvester that had been modified into an assault transport sat in a concealed hangar. It was meant for ground operations, but it could reach low orbit if pushed hard enough. Daewon wanted to refuse. Hana was too valuable to risk on a rescue mission, but he looked at her face and knew she would go whether he approved or not. He gave the authorization and prayed he was not about to lose 2 of his best people. Hana launched the converted harvester 10 minutes later. The craft looked ridiculous, like someone had strapped rockets to a farming machine. But it flew, and it was fast. She punched through the atmosphere at speeds that made the hull glow red. Her navigational computer screamed warnings that she ignored. The Vraxian command ship was tumbling slowly as it fell. Hana matched its rotation and approached the port side where Taesung had marked a serviceable airlock. Getting close enough to dock while both vessels were moving at orbital velocity was like threading a needle during an earthquake. She had one chance. Inside the ship, Taesung had reached the bridge. What he found there was not what he expected. Vice Admiral Krelthas sat in his command chair, alone except for 2 injured officers. The rest of the bridge crew was dead or evacuated. The Vice Admiral looked at Taesung with eyes that showed no fear, only a kind of tired respect. Krelthas asked if the human had come to kill him. Taesung said no. He had come to take the Vice Admiral prisoner. It was the only way to end the battle without more deaths on both sides. Krelthas considered this and then nodded slowly. He was a warrior, but he was not a fool. His fleet was destroyed. His army was surrounded. Continuing to fight would only kill more Vraxians for no gain. The Vice Admiral stood and offered his command codes to Taesung. With those codes, the remaining Vraxian forces could be ordered to stand down, but they had to get off the ship first. Taesung explained that a rescue craft was coming. Krelthas looked at the young human with something like admiration. They sent a single farmer to capture a flag officer. Either the humans were desperate, or they had more confidence than any species he had ever encountered. Hana's voice crackled over Taesung's communicator. She was at the airlock, but the docking collar was damaged. He would have to manually open it from inside. Taesung and Krelthas moved through the dying ship, helping the 2 injured Vraxian officers. The ship groaned and shook around them. Time was running out. They reached the airlock as the ship entered the upper atmosphere. Through the small window, Taesung could see Hana's transport holding position. The docking collar was indeed damaged, twisted from an earlier impact. He activated the emergency manual override and began cranking the wheel that would open the outer door. The wheel was stiff, and each turn took enormous effort. Krelthas moved to help him despite being the prisoner. The two of them worked together, turning the wheel while the ship fell and burned around them. The door opened with a shriek of tortured metal. Hana had to fire maneuvering thrusters constantly to stay aligned with the tumbling ship. The two vessels were now deep enough into the atmosphere that the air was beginning to heat their hulls. She could see flames starting to lick around the Vraxian ship's edges. Where was Tae-sung? The young colonist appeared in the airlock with 4 figures behind him. Hana matched the airlock perfectly and opened her own doors. The 5 of them jumped across the gap one at a time while both ships shook and burned. Tae-sung was last. He leapt just as a massive explosion tore through the command ship's engineering section. Hana caught him with one hand while firing thrusters with the other. The Vraxian ship broke apart behind them, scattering debris across the sky. She pushed her transport as hard as it would go, racing away from the falling wreckage and back toward space. They made it. Barely. The harvester-turned transport screamed in protest but held together. Hana set course for New Haven and finally allowed herself to breathe. In the back of the craft, Tae-sung sat next to Vice Admiral Krelthas, both of them exhausted and alive. Krelthas transmitted his surrender codes to all remaining Vraxian forces. On the ground, 30,000 Vraxian warriors laid down their weapons. In orbit, what was left of the Vraxian fleet powered down their weapons and shields. The battle was over. Admiral Park contacted Daewon directly. The human fleet had secured orbit. Medical ships were landing to help with casualties on both sides. He also brought news. The Galactic Council had been watching the battle. A neutral observer named Kixtara had recorded everything and was preparing a report. That report would change everything. The galaxy had watched a human farming colony defeat a Vraxian invasion fleet. They had seen the weapons hidden in plain sight. They had witnessed human soldiers who grew crops one day and fought wars the next. Every species that had dismissed humanity as weak and peaceful was reconsidering their assessment. 3 days later, Kixtara delivered her report to the Galactic Council. She described New Haven's defenses in detail. She explained how humans had turned every aspect of their civilian infrastructure into military assets. She noted that if one human colony was built this way, others probably were too. Her conclusion was simple. Any species that attacked human settlements should expect to fight a fully prepared military force. The Vraxian Empire's high command received the report with shock. They had started a war by attacking what they thought was a defenseless farm. Instead, they had lost 2 fleets and 40,000 warriors. Worse, they had revealed their tactics and capabilities to an enemy that had been prepared for them all along. The Empire opened negotiations immediately. They proposed a non-aggression treaty with humanity. All human colonies would be considered sovereign territory. The Vraxians would pay reparations for the damage to New Haven. In exchange, humanity would return the Vraxian prisoners and agree to peace. Daewon represented New Haven in the negotiations. He sat across from Vraxian diplomats who looked at him with new respect and perhaps some fear. They asked him questions about other human colonies. Were they all like New Haven? Were the farms all fortresses? Was every farmer a soldier? Daewon told them the truth because the lie no longer served any purpose. Yes, every human colony was designed the same way. Every agricultural world had military capabilities hidden in its infrastructure. Every colonist had training and equipment ready to deploy. Humanity had learned long ago that the galaxy was dangerous. They prepared accordingly. One of the Vraxian diplomats asked why. Why build colonies this way? Why not just have obvious military bases? Daewon explained that humans valued peace and farming. They wanted to grow food and raise families. But they also knew that appearing weak invited attack. So they built settlements that could do both. Farm when left alone, fight when threatened. The negotiations concluded successfully. The Vraxian Empire signed a treaty that recognized human territory and agreed to peace. Krelthas was released along with all other prisoners. The Vice Admiral asked to speak with Daewon privately before leaving. The 2 men stood on the rebuilt administration building's roof, looking out over New Haven. The colony was scarred but recovering. Fields were being replanted. Damaged buildings were being repaired. Life was returning to normal. Krelthas asked the question that had been bothering him since his capture. How many human farming colonies were actually military bases? Day-Wan smiled and gave an answer that would be repeated across the galaxy. Every single one. The Vice Admiral absorbed this information and nodded slowly. The Vraxian Empire had been looking for easy conquests and soft targets. They had found neither in humanity. He thanked Day-Wan for sparing his life and boarded his transport with his fellow prisoners. As the Vraxian ships departed, Tae-Sung joined Day-Wan on the roof. The young man had been promoted for his bravery, though he insisted he had just done what needed to be done. They watched the last enemy vessels disappear into hyperspace. Tae-Sung asked if it was really over. Day-Wan shook his head. The Vraxians were defeated, but there were other species in the galaxy. Some would see New Haven's victory as a warning. Others would see it as a challenge. Humanity would face more threats. But now the galaxy knew the truth. Human farmers could fight. Human colonies were not soft targets. Across New Haven, life continued. Kyung-ho was teaching new colonists how to maintain the farming equipment. Soo-jin was developing new crop varieties that were even more versatile. Hana was designing improvements to the colony's defenses. Miran was building more drones. Yuna was expanding the communication network. Hyunwoo was training the next generation of soldiers who would also be farmers. The colony that looked like a simple agricultural settlement was preparing for the next threat. Because that was what human colonies did. They grew food to feed humanity's expansion into the stars, and they stood ready to defend that expansion against anyone foolish enough to attack. The harvest was over. The fields were being replanted, and New Haven was ready for whatever came next. In the end, the galaxy learned an important lesson. When you see a human farming colony, remember what happened to the Vraxians. Those peaceful-looking farms might just harvest more than crops. They might harvest your entire army if you're foolish enough to attack. Humanity had made its statement. The message was clear and simple. Leave us in peace and we will farm. Threaten us and we will show you what happens when farmers go to war. The galaxy could choose which version of humanity it wanted to meet. Most species chose wisely. The few that did not learned the same lesson the Vraxians had learned. When humans harvest, they harvest everything, including their enemies.